left the ring, everybody in the Sky Dome was watching me instead of what was going on in the ring. So you guys are awesome. And the last thing I gotta say, people always ask me, what was, am I talking too much now? No! I just gotta get this off my chest, okay? People always ask me, what was your greatest moment in wrestling? And you know, I keep going, well, you know, Andre the Giant thing was cool, that the brother put me over and passed the torch. And that was a huge moment. But then on the other hand, when I came back to the WWF at the time, and I've been working for this guy over here, and Ted Turner, when I came back to the WWF, they said, well, Hogan, everything's different now. If you're going to come back, you better really bring it. And I'm thinking, well, if I bring it, you may want me to take it back. But anyway, at the end of the day, you know, we did everything. You know, we came in with the NWO, we did everything we could to get heat. We beat The Rock with a hammer. We put him in the back of the ambulance. I ran him over with a semi. I thought for sure when I came to Toronto, I was going to get some heat. But as soon as The Rock started on me, man, you guys booed him out of the building. At the end of the day, when people say, what was your greatest moment? I think about the Andre the Giant thing, you know. That was a work, and he put me over, and that was great. But the thing that was really, really cool, the thing that was a shoot, is when I went to the Sky Dome against The Rock, the promoter, the storyline, no matter what the temperature is outside, no matter if the guy's a good guy or a bad guy, you can't tell the fans that love you and are loyal who to cheer for, who to boo, because you guys made a statement that night, and you showed the whole world that no matter what I did, or how evil I got, you guys were still with me. I love you for that. So thank you. Here's the deal. You guys have heard a lot of good and bad things about me, okay? You've heard a lot of good and bad things about this man over here. But hey, easy, brother. But I'm here to tell you, man, this guy is a good person. There's not a bad bone in his body. Every once in a while, you're going to grab him and shake him. But he's a really good friend. I love him to death, man. And this is Easy Eric. Give me some money or something. I need some money, I'm broke. Okay, I like that shirt, dude. Silver Dome, I love it. Yeah, I can sign it. Man, you guys are brutal, dude. You want me to drop an elbow on you? Woo! This is for me. Oh, the shirt. Dude, I don't know if I can bend over that far. Alright, cool, I got you. Jeez, dude. Where's my $100? You want me to start with this? You can do it. Get that marker, bro. That's better. Sweet. Hi, brother. Oh, Bishop signed it already. I bet he made you paid. You got it, dude. You cool. Need fruit. Woo!
What about the rest of us now?
Mine too!
We can pull something up better than that. Well, let me try to get control of this before I get started. Sorry, guys, I need to get comfortable. Thank you, brother. I just got my back cut on 2 weeks ago again. It's a little stiff. You know the thing was, all day long they're going, hey, Hogan, it's nice to meet you. Right there. I pulled my shirt, show them that spot. Right in the middle.
Oh.
One here, right in the middle. Kind of looks like a road map. A rails and gas. They told me I couldn't fly for 3 weeks when I'm here. You guys are awesome, man.
I don't know if I want to bring that one up.
That's moving.
That one might scare me a little bit if I see it too often.
Cool.
We're going to get into a lot of different questions, and I encourage everybody here tonight to ask the wrestling questions that people like to talk about, but also to get into the different things that make you tick and your different experiences in the business of professional wrestling and all that. We'll get into a lot of that. But we're here in Canada, we're here in Toronto. Obviously, you've got a long career in this business, but when you think back, what's the first thing that you can recall experiencing here in Canada?
Oh my God! Well, the first thing that happened was I zipped up to Montreal.
Yeah. Woo! Shut up!
There was an old building there called the Paul Sauvé Arena back in the day, way before you guys were born. And I remember walking in there, and Jean Ferry, Andre the Giant, was in there. And I went to sit down next to him. He goes, "Move!" And I mean, at the time, we weren't friends. And that was my first experience, sitting in that dressing room with Andre, Gino Brito, Dino Bravo, Compartier, all these guys. The Beast was in there.
Oh, wow.
Mad Dog Bashan, every dog has his day.
Yeah.
I was in there, brother, and I was like the guy from Florida, man. And I caught myself sitting on the end of the dressing room, and all the Montreal guys, all the Canadian guys were there. And Vince Sr. had sent me up. And it took me about 4 or 5 trips up here to get the guys to loosen up, and quit leaving the lace prints and then the bruises on me. But I remember when I first went to Montreal, man, those guys didn't want me around. So that was my first memory coming to Canada. And then I remember everybody's getting paid. It looked like a stack of Canadian money. And Gino Brito would hand me like $200. Canadian. Man, I was semi-main event. I saw the guys in the preliminary matches walking out with a bigger wad of money than I had. But it was a good time. But I learned a lot, hanging out in that dressing room in Montreal. And then finally, they started to like me and everything became cool. But man, I hated going up there first. It was tough.
What do you think is, and we've talked about this for years, every city, has its own personality, every city's a little bit different, but there's something unique about Canadian fans in general, and especially Toronto and Montreal.
Yeah.
But what do you think the biggest difference is, or how do you explain the difference in the crowd and the fans between the U.S. audience and the Canadian audience?
You mean now or then?
Both.
Well, back then, the biggest difference, Canada had the best strip bars.
Yeah.
I remember in Montreal, the skate.
Yeah, buddy.
I remember all the really good ones.
Yeah.
Toronto had some good ones. But then I grew out of that, brother. Then I grew out of that. But the difference, just joking around. But actually, the real difference is how loyal the fans are. I mean, this has not been a smooth road. There's been some rough spots along the way, and no matter whatever happened, all the fans, from the West Coast to the East Coast of Canada, all the fans, they've been there, they've stuck with me through thick and thin, and that's the difference. Instantly in the United States in the late 80s, early 90s, when that whole steroid thing went down, the first thing when I went out and instead of seeing train and say your prayers, eat your vitamins, you'd see a sign, "Hey, Hogan, did you take your shot today?" or something, and they turned on me instantly.
Right.
But here in Canada, brother, everybody was always cool, they really were. That's the biggest difference. The Canadian fans are so darn loyal. Once you're in their respect, and once you have that love affair with them, man, they'll never leave you. I can go out to the ring in a wheelchair, brother, and they still cheer me.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Woo!
Part of that may be because, fans in different markets, but particularly again here in Canada, a lot of that loyalty is because of their knowledge of the history of the traditions of professional wrestling. And it seems to me, at least, that Canadian fans are just a little more intense about the legacy and the history of the sport. And just earlier today, and if the gentleman is here, please stand up and take a bow quietly. But there's a book out, and I just had a chance to glance through it. on the way up here that specifically talks about Montreal and the history of Montreal and professional wrestling. And in the brief 5 minutes I had to look at it, there's a lot of history, in Canada. And we're talking about the fans.
Book, right?
I've got the book.
That's
Yeah.
my book.
No, he gave it to me as I was
He gave
walking out
you.
the door. Yeah, he gave yours to Darren. Don't worry, Darren's got you.
That's on Mad Dogs, Midgets, and Screwjobs.
Exactly. But we were talking just a few moments ago about the fans and how they're different. How would you describe the difference between wrestlers who are from Canada and grew up and trained here versus wrestlers who maybe, grew up and trained in the United States and didn't have that much experience here?
Well, the main thing is, the art form. And things have changed so much, now you get a pair of boots from Santa Claus and you go to wrestling school. Well, back in the day, when I tried to get in the business, there were 8 guys sitting in a dressing room. You had to take somebody's spot, somebody's job, and somebody's livelihood away. So the whole mindset was pretty barbaric back then. And actually, back in the day, it was a lot of the headlock, takeovers, working wrestling holds, and there wasn't a bunch of high spots and jumping around and kicking a guy 45 times in the corner, which doesn't mean anything. And it's basically, that old school mentality. The Canadian wrestlers, pretty much stuck with it. The Rick Martells, the Rougeaus, the Dino Bravos. If the crowd got bored or you heard like a boring or something, the Canadian guys would go back to the basics and grab a hold and hang on and pull the guy down and hang on and pull the guy down. And finally the building would start rumbling. And a lot of that art form was lost in the States, but, the guys from, especially the guys that I knew from Toronto and Quebec and Montreal, they all went right back to the basics. That was the main difference. They were a bunch of high spot guys. They knew how to, get a bunch of heat, get everybody pissed off, how to get everybody rumbling and just blow the roof off the place. So they kind of really went back to the way I was trained back in the 70s,
What about the legacy, if you will, or the imprint that Stu Hart left on the business? Obviously, there's a lot of tradition there in history. How do you think that that's affected wrestling in general?
Well, there were 3 or 4 really hot points for wrestling. Where I grew up as a kid in Tampa, Florida, we had Eddie Graham there, and all the great wrestlers would come through from New York and Minnesota and from Canada would come through. So growing up, I got to see the local guys. Plus, I got to see the big stars come in. And there was a guy named Hiro Matsuda that was into the hooks, boom, the breaking bones and the stretching. And if you wanted to get in the business, you had to go through his training. We had another guy in Minnesota, where you grew up, Vern Gagne, who had that same attitude and the same mentality. And then we had another guy, we had Stu Hart up in Calgary, who had a bunch of sons that turned out to be great wrestlers. And Stu, and between Owen and Brett, I couldn't tell you who was the greatest, but those 2 guys really stepped up and carried on the Hart legacy. Bruce was good, but Brett and Owen really stepped up. But the mentality that Stu had was he didn't want anybody in the business. He wanted somebody that had heart and had guts, and if you twisted your ankle and ripped all your ligaments out, he wanted to see if you'd come back a couple months later. So he had that same mentality, but he basically protected the art form. He made sure none of the jabronis got into business, And Stu basically kept the sacred art form alive, which is the basis of our business. So he kept things grounded in Canada.
Do you think that influence really carried over into the United States? You remember when you were coming up, for example, you remember guys who were coming up with you recognizing the difference in the 2 styles, or even recognizing some of the talent that was coming out of Stu Hart's camp?
Yeah, well, my first run-in with anybody from Stu Hart's camp was Brett. And when I first started wrestling in Florida, I quit a couple times. And then when I went up to Atlanta the first time, there was an apartment complex called Mrs. T's where all the wrestlers lived. And Brett lived across the hall from me, and Buzz Sawyer and a couple other guys were up there. But I first noticed with Brett, going back to the hole, taking a guy down. And Brett was in a lot of 20-minute matches like I was to open the card. And that's when I noticed, man, this guy looks like one of the guys here on Matsuda would train. But that was one of my first run-ins, and it just ran true to the whole business with all the Canadian guys, from the Rougeos to all the guys. They all had that basic foundation that you really need.
Let's go back, and we'll come back to talking about Canada and the difference between the fans and the wrestlers and some of your memories of Canadian performances that you had here. But let's talk a little bit about, and you just mentioned a moment ago, kind of starting and stopping your career, kind of quitting and walking away from it. Share with everybody here a little bit about that period of time, because it really is kind of fascinating.
Yeah, well, I mean, I did anything to avoid working a real job. And, found out that if you played music in high school, you could work on weekends when most of the kids were playing baseball and sports. You could work on the weekend and make money. So I played music, and, during the weekends, I'd make money playing in the colleges and the fraternity parties. And then it kind of parlayed into a full-time job when I got out of high school. So one thing led to another. I was a huge wrestling fan. Would go watch wrestling every Tuesday at the Armory, and then Wednesdays they'd film TV. I was always chasing the wrestlers around, and finally, it got to the point where I drove them completely crazy, just chasing these guys around, and I was scared to death of them, because back in the day, no one smartened anybody up. You didn't know what a heel or a babyface was. You didn't know what was a work. You didn't know anything. You just knew if a wrestler looked at you wrong, he would kill you, And so finally, I drove them so crazy, they gave me a tryout. And the first day I went down to Hiro Matsuda broke my leg. And so, about 14 weeks later, I went back, and he beat on me for a couple years until he finally let me in the business. And what I didn't realize was everybody around the Florida area didn't want a local guy like me in the business. So, I was wrestling 11, 12, 13 times a week, and they'd give me a check for like $100, and all the older guys like Johnny Valentine and The Rock's dad, Rocky Johnson, they'd have me driving everywhere, paying for gas, and these guys would be sleeping, drinking beer, and I'd be driving 300, 400, 500 miles, And I was kind of like their gopher. So after, a couple months of spending money and wrestling and being hurt and not making any money, I just quit. And I went back to the docks because I was a longshoreman. I would load ships, get in the union. And that happened 2 or 3 times. That I wrestled for a little while and quit, wrestled for a little while and quit, even went to Memphis for a while and wrestled and quit, until I finally got the call from Vince McMahon Sr., and that's when I finally stuck with it.
Did you ever, at any point in the early part of your career, before you knew what Hulk Hogan was going to end up being, obviously, but in the early part of your career, did you ever kind of wish you would have stuck with rock and roll, stuck with music instead of wrestle?
Well, I couldn't sing with the damn. I turned into a pretty good bass player after about 10 years. But, I just knew that, the guys that I was in the band with, we had a chance to go on the road with a band called Mother's Finest out of Atlanta and Blackfoot to do the opening. And when we finally got this chance to go up and down the East Coast on this national tour, 2 of the guys were married with kids, and they didn't want to go. So that pretty much put a bullet in the plans anyway. And it was right about the time I was chasing the wrestlers around, and I thought back on it, And once I got the wrestling business, I thought, well, what would have happened if I'd have stuck it out another 10 years? Nah, I'd rather wrestle. I never really wanted to go back.
Do you think that there's something, performing